Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Political Deep Dive. Tonight, we are doing episode two of United States Iran relations. Thought I could do it all last week, but it is a very complex and uh, long and daunting relationship between the two countries. So we got up to the point of the Iranian Revolution, and let's just go over a quick recap of things that we discussed last week. The major flashpoints of the relationship, of course, start with the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. He was not the popularly elected leader of Iran. His party won the parliamentary election. The party selected him as their prime minister designate, and the Shah acceded to that election. So he was the prime minister of Iran, was overthrown because he nationalized the oil, and the United States and Brits interfered with the internal affairs the uh, of Iran, which is a constant theme for Iran throughout the years. Whether it's the Ottomans, the Brits, the Russians, it's a constant theme for Iran going into the late 70s. Um, the other flashpoints, and particularly last week we were talking about flashpoints that were really going from the United States towards Iran. The other flashpoints were that the United States trained, along with the Israeli Mossad, the brutal secret police force known as Savak, that repressed students and clerics and bazaris and was one of the most brutal regimes, secret polices in the world. um the Shah was buying tons, using that material wealth that he was getting off of the oil, to buy an extremely powerful military, primarily from the United States. He got to the point where he's one of the top three or four militaries in the world. And this is eclipsing countries like Britain and France and things like that because, he just dumped so much money into his military, mid 60s, 70s, when those countries were kind of divesting from their military and relying more on the United States for security. Um, you know, s- so there were the seeds of revolution were being planted: repression, wasting of resources. There was the extravagant 1971 party in the middle of nowhere Persepolis, for the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. Um, that was completely wasteful. Had really no outside of the Shah, had no Iranian presence in that celebration. It was just a kind of a show off to the entire world of Iranian decadence and power, and it really sowed the seeds of the eventual destruction of the Shah. Um, the repression of the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ruhollah Khomeini, sent off into exile in Iraq, and then eventually France before coming back. And let's go into where we were at this point. This was the revolution, flashpoints of the revolution. So, the Ayatollah had sent cassette tapes of speeches denouncing the Shah. Those were disseminated all over the country, and it was done by either making copies of the cassette tapes that are actually playing it on. They do a phone call to a mosque or a religious school, and people would listen to the speech of the Ayatollah, and he was laying out all of the decadence and the crimes of the Shah, and he was inciting the people. And remember that the Shah had turned over a lot of the education for, and I'm just saying hi to a lot of people. Thank you for coming in and watching. I really appreciate it. Shah had turned over a lot of the education to those madrasas because the state just was too busy investing all of their money uh, into military, into other decadent things, to actually invest that money back into education. So uh, you know th- most of the people were now having that drilled into their head, of the Shah being a bad person and the Ayatollah as be this guy that's fighting for the the rights of everyday Iranians, and that is, you know, it, it it's making its headways. And then, you know, the Shah becoming sick as we get into the middle and late 70s, ignoring and you know, kind of showing hubris as far as, you know, his medical condition, ignoring the cancer as it spreads throughout his body from, you know, from common lymphatic cancer, it metastasizes. By 1978, he is, you know, in stage 4 cancer. It's terminal. The United States finally learns of this. Uh, and there's a series of missteps that, you know, are blamed on the Shah. One, the Cinema Rex fire in Abadan, the Black Friday massacre, which is directly traceable to the Shah. And at this point, you know, early 1979, the heads of the United States, Britain, France, and West Germany meet on the island of Guadeloupe to discuss the security situation in Iran. And the Shah takes this as the Western leaders have abandoned him. Um, so he no longer has his backing like he's had for the last 30 years. Uh, and he decides to leave Iran. Initially goes to Egypt, and he hops around the world for a few weeks to months. Comes to the United States at one point before settling back in Egypt in exile, where he eventually passes away. 2 weeks after he leaves Iran, the Ayatollah, and tomorrow I believe is the 42nd anniversary of the Shah returning to Iran. Um, so it's February 1st of 1979. He returns to Iran, and really the government collapses at that point. You know, there's reprisals. There's, you know, everything typically that you'll see with an uprising like that. So let me pop into here. The next big thing that happens, you know, there's really kind of this uh, interim period between the time the Shah falls and the Islamic government gets set up. You know, there's a couple prime ministers that serve very short periods. There's some assassinations. It's a very unstable point. The U.S. did try and bring in a NATO general to initiate the military to take over and intervene again. Um, and you know, throughout the students led the hostage crisis, and these students were taught by people who had lived through the most of that crisis, so that this story gets passed down to people, so that you know, everyone kind of knows this story. It's not, you know, wasn't taught in the Shaw schools, but it was taught in the madrasas. It was taught passed down through family, that people knew that the United States had intervened in Iran's policies or politics. So they knew that the embassy was the flashpoint of the previous revolution, and there was worry that the United States would intervene again, and they were, you know, the NATO general was intervening, you know, talking to the military leaders. The military leaders balked at it because, I mean, they're like, "Have you seen the streets? Do you think we could take that over?" Um, so we weren't able to be successful in that avenue. So the rumors get on the streets. I get, you know, the story gets out that the CIA is planning to intervene again, and the issue with that is that the students were like, no, listen, we can't let this happen again. We are going to, we're going to intervene ourselves. So they, you know, the morning that it happens, they hop the fence. They basically bash in the fence at the U.S. Embassy compound in Tehran, and they take 52 Americans that worked at the embassy, whether they were CIA or State Department. They took them hostage, and they held them for over a year. Um, 444 days. You know, people will point out that the television show on ABC, Nightline, started during the midst of this, and every day that show would come on, it would highlight the number of days that the hostage was being held, and this started cutting across all media. I remember Walter Cronkite, you know, opening and closing his show, day, you know, whatever, of the Iranian hostage crisis. Um, you know, if you watch the 2012 movie Argo with Ben Affleck, It's a true story. They used the ruse of, it's kind of in this intervening period between the Shah and when, the Ayatollah can really fully take control of the country, that they were able to, affect this daring rescue of six people who actually managed to escape the initial onslaught of the embassy, and get them out of Iran. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a fantastic movie. I think it does downplay a little bit of, what the Canadians' role was in it. The six that escaped got to the Canadian embassy, and the Canadian embassy was never overrun, although it was threatened. Um, the things that happened during the hostage crisis, like the Operation Eagle Claw, when we flew in several choppers to effect some kind of rescue from the American embassy, resulted in the death of American servicemen. Two of the choppers collided. It was a very messy operation, um, and really all of this, the inability to get the hostages back, the failure of that military uh, intervention, really kind of makes Jimmy Carter look impotent, and he loses the subsequent election. I mean, it was a landslide. There's probably a good chance that Reagan would have won the election that year anyway, but this just did not help. It was a very black mark for the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So he goes down to defeat. There's a new quote unquote sheriff in town. During the last months of the Carter administration, they do start negotiating. It comes up with the Algiers Accord, which is agreed to really as Carter is walking out the door of the White House, and Reagan is coming in, and the hostages are released. It's announced as Reagan walks into the White House for the first time. Um, it kind of sends him into the White House on a high note, um, and it almost it really does kind of, as a kick in the teeth to the Carter administration as they're walking out the door. The hostages are finally released. You know, the students had demands. They didn't want the United States to intervene in Iranian internal affairs, which will we'll say a mission accomplished to an extent. That the Algiers Accords put on a stipulation that Americans couldn't sue the Iranian government for the actions of the students. Um, that's been a sticking point over the years, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, they wanted the handover of the Shah. Uh, as we go into the hostage crisis, the Shah actually dies. During the hostage crisis, he dies of cancer in Cairo, and is buried at a mosque there in Cairo. Not He never was returned to Iran. Algiers Accord also turned over some money that the Shah had in the United States, and that becomes a sticking point when we get down to the JCPOA later, talking about the money that was handed over with the Iran with the Shah uh, later in 2013. So um, anyway, so the Algiers Accords comes into effect. The hostages are released, but there is plenty of anger between the United States and the Iranians. So it's a big wedge issue between the United States and Iran. Never really been dealt with adequately, but that's just another issue that remains unresolved between the two countries. Right around this time, we start talking about the Iran-Iraq War. The hostages are still being held. This is probably some impetus into why the Iranians began to negotiate with the United States regarding Algiers Accords. Iraq invades Iran, and Iraq is coveting this specific region within Iran called Khuzestan. It is in the southwestern corner. I mean, if you look at Iran, it's uh, it's kind of an elongated country this way. Khuzestan is kind of in this area. It is populated by Arab Shiite members. So they're Arabs. They're not ethnic Persians, um, which is kind of an amalgamous term for everyone else in Iran. But they're Arabs rather than Persians or Kurds or Azeris or Balokis. So there's this part of it is to get this Arab section of the country, but really the want is this is the oil area of Iran. This is where vast parts of the oil fields are, and it also has waterways, deep water ports to get oil out to the rest of the world. Iraq just doesn't have it. The Shat al Arab waterway is really just kind of a marsh, and it's not a really good deep water port to get oil and everything out to the rest of the world. So, um, that was the two big reasons for Iraq. Plus, they wanted to hit Iran when Iran was vulnerable, when Iran was facing another foe, and they thought that in doing this they would curry favor with the United States, which they did. And and this leads to another flashpoint with Iran and the United States. The United States shifts its support to Iraq to marginalize Iran. We get into bed with a very unsavory person named Saddam Hussein. We give them military support, lots of military weaponry. We also do agricultural support. And within that agricultural support is the basis for the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons program. And during the Iran Iraq War, the Iraqis employed mustard gas, sarin, you know, basically anything to try and take out the Iranians. The Iranians did have a somewhat military advantage from all the stuff that the Shah had, but that stuff was starting to break down because once the U.S. pulled out their military support, that stuff does not hold up well over time, and eventually you need to replace parts, and they're not able to get parts for it. But they still had when they had uh, a population advantage, military size advantage in Iran. So the Iraqis were using chemical weapons to kind of level the field. Now, it doesn't excuse what they did. That's completely against the Geneva Conventions. I mean, it's a shitty thing to do, with lack of a better term for it. So Saddam not only uses the chemical weapons on Iran, he also uses it on his own people. Um, but if in the end, as with most wars, the war really doesn't solve anything. When they finally settle it, there's no land that changes hands. The borders of Iran and Iraq stay the same as they did pre 1979. There's casualties, just the number of casualties, 2 to 600,000 Iranian, and that's just military. We're not talking civilian casualties here. And with the Iraqi military, 100 to 500,000 casualties within those two countries, all for nothing. And this is a knock on throughout the 80s. There's just so many knock on things that derive out of this whole conflict that really just set the tone for what goes on further into the future. So let's talk about some of those. One of the things is that Iran is very keen on exporting the Islamic Revolution. They want more countries to be these theocratic states with a strong uh, imami-led uh, country, or Ayatollah-led country. Um, so they started really picking up support throughout the country. So like Iraq has a large Shiite population. They were fomenting issues within that. They went especially into Lebanon with Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and all those other groups. Um, it continues on to today where they're arming the Houthi rebels in Yemen and are part of that whole genocide that's going on in Yemen today. some of the big things that come out of this is, like the Beirut embassy bombing that killed 263 U.S. Marines. So now we're starting to see Iran actually push back on the United States. You have the hostage situation that makes the U.S. look impotent. You have the embassy bombing that strikes at the heart of American military. The big bad Marines. They're also doing things in South America. There was an Argentine center that was bombed, a Jewish center that was bombed, and they're really kind of taking up that cause of Palestinian independence and Palestinian, uh, uh, you know, trying to curry favor with the Palestinians. So that affects both Palestine and Lebanon. And we see academics at the American University of Beirut being abducted throughout the 1980s. So you see multiple academics are held hostage. And again, this is kind of an empatizing stain on the United States. It makes us look weak. And Reagan, and excuse me, I'm trying to get everybody back up here so I can make sure I get your questions. Reagan is getting very frustrated as to not being able to get uh, the Iranians, trying to get the hostages back. So in 1985, just after he gets reelected, he started, Iran, he was famous for saying that the United States does not deal with terrorists. He had attacked, Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and that was kind of the Reagan doctrine was, you don't deal with terrorists. But they had long labeled since the revolution the Iranians a state sponsor of terrorism. Um, Reagan was very keen on breaking the idea, breaking communism in the Western Hemisphere, and one of those communist regimes was in Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega led the Sandinista government, communist government of Nicaragua, uh, and he was keen on arming the Contras, the rebels fighting against the Sandinista government. Um, Congress forbade it. They had actually written a law to say, no, you can't. We're not going to fund the Contras. Reagan, at least his administration, allegedly, we can debate how much Reagan knew about this, but the administration went around Congress and looked at, how do we get money to the Contras for them to buy weapons and all that stuff, or how do we get weapons to the Contras? So what they did was they sold weapons to Iran, and the cash there was unmarked, untraceable, was able to buy weapons for the Sandinistas. And this goes on for a little while. And the thing with selling weapons to Iran, part of it was to secure the release of the hostages in Beirut. Um, so it was arms for hostages and money for arms to the Sandinistas. This goes on for a while until 1986, when a CIA plane, private contractor of the CIA plane, was shot down in Nicaragua, filled with weapons for the Contras, and one of the survivors of the plane crash spills everything. Like, we were bought off by the CIA, and it starts this huge congressional inquiry. It's one of my first time really understanding what Congress does was watching the uh, Iran Contra hearings. Uh, Oliver North, who was on the National Security Council, and John Poindexter with CIA, they take the fall for it. It never goes all the way up to the president of the United States. His idea was that it was more selling arms for hostages rather than the extended going on to so it's, that further on selling of, or taking that cash and buying weapons for the Sandinistas. Um, I I don't agree with that, but that's eventually what the Tower Commission found, and so Reagan does have a reputational hit from this. It doesn't last. He does leave the White House, one of the most popular presidents leaving the White House. So But it does mark a stain on his presidency going forward as historians begin to look at it more earnestly. Um, but blowback from the Iran Contra scandal is that the Iranians start really ramping up things in the Gulf because they're getting this influx of weapons from the United States. They're starting to take the offensive against the Iraqis in the Gulf. The Iraqis have been attacking their coastal facilities, some islands off of the coast that are close to the Straits of Hormuz. The Straits of Hormuz are this little waterway between Iran and uh, Oman and the UAE. It's a complicated border there with the Omanis and the UAE. But yeah, it's a very slim waterway that all this oil in in the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq and Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain and the UAE have to get it through this little waterway. Um, So one of the things that the Iranians start doing is they mine the waterway, and you start seeing ships getting damaged. You know they're doing it under guise of these old Gulf area fishing boats called dhows. They're loading them up with mines, and they go into the water and they dump these mines in the water. Um, so the U.S. in response to the mining of the Straits of Hormuz start flagging tankers coming out of Kuwait as U.S. ships, so that if one of those ships gets hit, then the United States can take direct action against Iran. The other thing that happens is they do capture a ship called the Ajar that is has contains like 10 mines that weren't laid. That was intercepted. Um, Further on in 1987, there was a USS Roberts was hit by one of these mines, and they were able to trace the type of mine to the ones that we found on the Odger, uh, and it was nearly sunk. And it led to a one-day shooting war between the United States and Iran. It was mainly in the Persian Gulf. They attacked a couple of oil platforms and sunk three or four Iranian ships. Um, but it becomes this game of cat and mouse throughout the Gulf, throughout the 87, 88 time frame. Um, at one point, there's a ship in the Persian Gulf named the USS Vincennes. It is chasing a couple of Iranian speedboats, and the Vincennes goes into Iranian territorial waters as it's chasing these speedboats. And as it does, it notices something in the sky above it that blips as an F-14. I'm not sure how they mistook an F-14 for a Airbus, but they shot out of the sky Iran Air 655 with 290 people on board. It fell into the Gulf. It was coming from Tehran to Dubai, and so all 290 people on board die. Um, uh, Very graphic images of bodies floating in the water. Um, Thing that struck me from the news at that time was first time seeing like just multiple bodies uh, on TV news. It was quite intense, and it's a stain on U.S. reputation because it was a American warship. These are trained fighters. They misread and did not communicate with or, did not communicate with the Iranians. Did not hail the aircraft. They just shot it down, and 290 people paid with it for their life, paid with it for their lives just because Iran and the United States are playing this cat and mouse game in the Persian Gulf. Um, so again, these tensions are rising. The tensions are rising. Um, I think part of this really does lead into, um, because the United States is getting more and more involved, it does get the Iranians and the Iraqis to the table to kind of negotiate the end of this war. And does that's a good thing that the war ended. It was one of the most pointless wars in world history. Um, it's when it comes to terms of lives lost and what was gained and what was lost over when it comes to land and things like that. Let's see, I got any questions? Nope. All right, so let's move on. Gulf War One and Gulf War Two. So yeah, Ayatollah Khomeini dies in 1989. There was worries that this guy was going to last, quite a bit longer. His father is killed supposedly by the Shah, um, but his grandfather lived to like the age of 103. So there was fear that this guy was going to, be in charge of Iran for a long time. But he blows a coronary in 1989. And if you ever seen something, if you want to see something wild, go on YouTube and Google his funeral procession, because it gets real there. It gets real, real. Um, it's a wild time. Lots of grief, lots of like overflowing grief. But he's replaced by the president of Iran at the time, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and it's interesting with Iranian names here because they are very similar, and it's easy to get confused. But Khamenei is was a former political prisoner of the Shah, and serves in prison in their late 60s, early 70s. Gets out, becomes a political figure in the revolution. He becomes president, I believe second or third president of Iran, and takes over as supreme leader in Iran. And let's mention at this point that the way that Iran's leadership is set up is that there is the supreme leader, which is the supreme uh, religious voice, because it's a Islamic republic. The Islamic voice is the Ayatollah, which means sign of God. Uh, that's the meaning of the term Ayatollah. Uh, so he is the highest religious leader in the country, and there's a guardian council below him that manages a lot of the day to day things. They have a lot big say in day to day matters of Iran. Below that is the president. The president is elected to 4 year terms. It's everyone has been reelected to, and they've served 2 terms, and they've been reelected. So it's like 8 years, 8 years, 8 years. Um, uh, Below that is a prime minister, and below that is the Majlis, the constitutional or consultative parliament of Iran. The power, though, lies with the Ayatollah as the supreme leader and the Guardian Council, and we'll see this manipulate in shortly. So, we replace, Ali Khamenei comes into power. Saddam, after the Gulf War, or after the Iran-Iraq War, he still needs an outlet to get his oil to the market. So he turns to Kuwait, and probably the worst person to, I think her name is April Gatsby, that was the State Department representative in this meeting, said that the United States would turn a blind eye if Iran moved on Kuwait. Well, Iran moves on Kuwait, or I'm sorry, Iraq moves on Kuwait. Uh, and all of a sudden the Saudis are like, whoa, hold on a second. They're within, a few miles of a vast swath of oil reserves. So the United States is then brought in to effect change, not regime change at this point, but at least get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. So we have the first Gulf War. The Iranians quietly support this because anything to weaken the Iraqis at this point. There's still a lot of bad blood. So yeah, I mean they're okay with this. Um, you know, After the Gulf War, they're kind of okay with the United States doing the no-fly zones and keeping Iraq marginalized, because again, it keeps them from deciding to do another war with Iran or whatever. Um, and that holds until September 11th, and September 11th happens. Uh, People will say that people celebrated in the Middle East when 9/11 happened. In Iran, it was quite the opposite. There were candlelight vigils. They had this big event at the soccer stadium, the main soccer stadium in Tehran. It really hit Iranians hard. They understood what we went through, and so that wasn't the what people were expecting when it came to Iran. But it was also during a period of very uh, liberalization within Iran. A gentleman named Mohammad Khatami was elected president in 1997. He was a reformer. He actually kind of flew under the radar with the Guardian Council because the Guardian Council can actually accept and reject candidates that are running for office. So previously, when he ran for parliament, he had been rejected as a candidate by the Guardian Council. But he gets in, he's elected kind of in a landslide. It was like 66% of Iranians voted for him, and it shocked the establishment there. He tries to go on this modernizing and reform dialogue of civilizations. I had a professor that actually went to Iran and studied in Iran for a year, um, uh, under the auspices of the State Department. Um, it was a good time for us to increase the dialogue, but 9/11 took us off the it took our eye off the ball. And um, it didn't help as we moved into 2002, 2003. We start talking about war again with Iran or with Iraq. We name Iran as part of the axis of evil. Um, and it doesn't help Khatami, and it leads to guys like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was elected in 2005 as president of Iran. And the discourse between the United States and Iran abruptly changes. Dialogue between civilization ends. You don't have American students studying in Iran and Iranian students studying in the United States. Uh, all that ends, and there is uh, rancor and a contentious relationship between Iran just rekindles. Um, and this is, as the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, when we launch it, they're not as supportive. It's not viewed as favorably in Iran as we launch that second Gulf War, uh, because Iran starts to feel closing in because you have, the United States Army sitting in military sitting in Afghanistan. We have forces in Tajikistan. We have forces in Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iraq now. So they're completely surrounded. The Fifth Fleet is sitting in Qatar, and they're right across the waterway. So yeah, Iran is completely surrounded at this point, and but because the U.S. mismanaged the Iraq invasion so badly, that at least the aftermath of the Iraq invasion so badly, Iran was able to foment more chaos, take advantage of that chaos and the political vacuum that was left in the wake of Saddam Hussein being removed, and the formation of militias, the Sadr militia, and things like that. They were able to take advantage of that and inflict damage on the United States, not only military terms, lives lost, but also reputationally in the area. So the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, really exacerbates tensions. Now we're in direct contact with the Iranians almost on a day-to-day basis when it comes to the U.S. and Iranian relations. Um, Let's see. Oh, there is a military coup going on in Myanmar. Yeah, I saw that Aung San Suu Kyi had been arrested. We'll talk about that in the After Dark program. But thanks for that, Mac. I really appreciate it. But yeah, Iran takes advantage, and they have been in a thorn in our side ever since. The other thing that really starts to crop up is the Iran nuclear program. Now, people think that the Iranian nuclear program started in 2003. It started in the 50s. The United States actually helped start it. There's a program called Atoms for Peace. They gave away reactors to universities to help study nuclear power and things like that. As time goes on, the Shah does develop an interest in developing nuclear weapons. Um, and the U.S. does kind of put the kibosh on that. After the revolution, the U.S. support dries up for it, of course. But they are still looking for, they know that they have these reactors and they want to be able to build reactors for power, and they also, they want to have that hedge against having foreign incursions again. So they want to enrich uranium to a weapons level. And I'm not a nuclear expert. I'm not going to go into like what enrichment level we need to get to have a nuclear weapon, but uh, that Western support dries up. They start getting support from countries like North Korea, which kind of, part of the reason why the Iran ends up on the axis of evils list, among all the other stuff that's been going on in the Middle East for the last 20 years from that point. Um, but the enrichment activities get revealed. They've discovered that Iran has centrifuges. They didn't have enough centrifuges anywhere near the number that would needed to get weapons grade nuclear material. But they start getting help from an old friend, technical advisors from Russia, from Vladimir Putin's Russia, start helping, and the worry starts to grow. Um, the Iranians start getting more centrifuges. They start enriching at a higher and higher level, although it's still nowhere near weapons grade level. So we move into the 2010s. The CIA starts getting worried, and they launch this plan to do something called Stuxnet. Stuxnet is a computer virus. Now, Iranian nuclear scientists were, just like you and me. I mean, they go home, they go surf the internet and do all that thing. But their computers are the same ones that they take home their work computer and they log onto the internet and they do all this stuff. And one scientist gets a virus and it's intentionally planted on his laptop, brings it in, plugs it into the network of the Iranian nuclear program, which they were smart in that it was a closed network that was safe. It should have been safe, but allowing people to unplug their computers and work outside the network was the downfall. And Stuxnet gets released into the Iranian nuclear um, system and destroys several centrifuges, destroys, sets them back years. Um, and in response, Iran starts to get more aggressive in the acquisition of centrifuges and to rebuild their program. And this is, as we're heading towards the end of the Ahmadinejad reign, and then we start moving into the reign of Hassan Rouhani, who is the current president of Iran. Now he is more keen on, how do we get Iran. He wants to protect Iran's ability to maintain their independence and things like that. But he's also keen on, let's get these sanctions off of the Iranian people, the Iranian government. So he begins to engage with the European Union, some of the members of the Obama administration, and they come up with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is not a treaty. Uh, and it's very important that this distinction is made because it's called a framework in exchange for certain things that the Iranians would do that the United States would match them with, reducing sanctions and turning out money. And then, when we talk about the joint JCPOA, one of the first things that they did was they turned over a bunch of money that the Shah had in the United States, and they turned it back to the Iranians. Um, and this angered people because the Algiers Accord, we were adhering to the Algiers Accord, but several courts in the United States had abrogated some parts of the Algiers Accord, which prevented Americans from suing the Iranian government over the hostage crisis. Um, and so the money that we turned over was also being used to pay off these families, and now the money dries up all of a sudden, and families who had judgments weren't getting paid. So there was a big controversy over that. Um, but the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is not officially listed as a treaty because the Obama administration didn't want to have to put it before the Senate for approval. Senate does have the right to advice and consent on treaties, and they didn't want to go through that. Um, so as we get down towards the end of the story here, and we'll wrap up here in about 7 minutes or so. The last big story that's happened in the Iranian U.S. Relations was Qassem Soleimani. He was the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force. Uh, he was, basically the United States blamed him for almost all of the international terror that was emanated from like Hezbollah within Iraq, with like the Sadr militias and the militias that remained after Sadr left the field. Um, and so he became a target. There were some attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad in 2019. There was an attack on U.S. Air Force or Air Base in Iraq also in 2019. And Donald Trump decided to take revenge rather than attacking the militia that attacked those bases. He went after Soleimani, the general, and the general of the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard. Um, and with the drone strike on January 3rd, 2020, at the beginning of last year, he is killed in a drone strike just after he lands at the airport in Baghdad. So we are killing a foreign leader without a declaration of war on foreign soil, on not even on Iranian soil, on foreign soil. Uh, so it becomes a very big story, and both sides moved to war footing. There was a very tense standoff there for a couple days. Iran had to, they don't have to, but they had to respond in some way. So I almost give them credit for this because they fired missiles into Iraq to hit a military base, and that military base was, where they hit in the military base wasn't uh, overly strategic. We did have soldiers get injured through, the explosions, and had hearing damage, but like actual, physical, I got hit by a missile damage, no. Um, so there was no like physical casualties. There was hearing casualties and that type of issue. Uh, at the same time as they're firing these missiles over there, it's another mistaken identity when it comes to a plane, but this time it's the Iranians. Um, a Ukrainian jetliner actually takes off from Tehran, Tehran's international airport, to fly back to Kiev, and or Kiev or whatever they call it now. And a missile battery thinks this is a U.S. response to the shooting of missiles into Iraq, and shoots the plane down. And not sure how many people died in the accident, but everyone on board was killed. And it was a very sad accident that this happened. It wouldn't have happened if cooler heads had prevailed, and Iran was not firing missiles into Iraq at the same time. So, but I think it brought both sides back from the brink at that point. I think the United States understood what Iran was doing and didn't see it as an ultimate escalation. And and you can tape this or whatever. I'll give the Trump administration, they did back down. I think he was getting good advice from the military commanders that maybe didn't give him good advice when it came to killing Qasem Soleimani, but they gave him good advice to not take this as an ultimate provocation to just start going into war. So let's talk about the future. We are now in the Biden administration, and there's questions because Donald Trump did back out of the JCPOA, and so this is the Iranians have recently announced that hey, we're going to start boosting the enrichment of uranium. We're again acquiring centrifuges and increasing our centrifuge capacity, and just to the point that they're just below that weapons grade enrichment level. And I think this is a ruse to get the United States back at the negotiating table. They have been harassing shipping. There was a Korean tanker that was taken in by the Iranians for supposedly violating their territorial waters. Um, but will Joe Biden come back to the JCPOA? Will we see us recommit to that? Another issue is that there's an age gap between the Iranian population and its leadership. So things like the revolution. Most of the people in Iran are born after the revolution. Most of the people in Iran's leadership were born, uh, before the Mossadegh overthrow. And you're starting to see, can we get younger leadership in? Every time the last few elections that have happened, there's been lots of manipulation from the supreme leader, the Guardian Council, and the president in charge, that have really kind of tipped it towards that, supporting the supreme leader, with guys like Ahmadinejad. Rouhani's not as bad as Ahmadinejad, but he's not great either. But the thing that holds, for now, is that the Iranian elections are happening in August, and who gets through by the Iranian Guardian Council to be the candidates that are officially on the ballot in Iran for president will mark how we move forward with Joe Biden as president. Do they put in a reformer or allow a reformer to run? I don't think so, but maybe a more moderate cleric, hopefully will again engage in a dialogue with the United States. Again, people when it comes to these things, the news starts harping on how bad Iran is. Iran is 80 million people. Uh, for the most part, Iranians don't hate the United States. Their government hates the United States. Iranian people don't hate the United States. I don't hate Iranians. I love Iranians. I think Iranians are fantastic. They're beautiful people. Um, and I caution people, if we build up towards another conflict with Iran, don't dehumanize them. They're humans. This is a beautiful country that's got a beautiful and long history, and that people should, uh, you know, they shouldn't discount them because the media tells you that Iran is bad. The A war with Iran will be devastating for all sides. Can we wipe out Iran? Sure. We could do it in a half hour. But we also have nuclear powers on the to the west of Iran. You can't do it like that. Um, and getting bogged down in a war, destroying centuries of beautiful uh, architecture and things like that. You just can't. To me, I think getting into a conflict with Iran is probably one of the dumber things we could do. If a 30-year war with Afghanistan is on the cards with us, it'll be 50 years or more. It'll outlast us as a country. And just mark my words on that. So anyway, you know what? Thank you guys once again. I'm sorry I didn't look too much at the questions. I didn't really get many questions tonight, but thank you so much for joining me tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about compassion, education, and love with outright libertarians, Ashley Shade. I'm so excited about that's not next week. I'm sorry, that's 2 weeks from now. Next week, we'll probably just be doing an After Dark program after the Super Bowl. If the Libertarian National Committee meeting is canceled, which I think it will be. So join us for the After Dark, after Super Bowl party. And join us here in a moment for After Dark with myself, Kara, Emily, and Tyler. But again, thank you so much for joining us. If you're on Twitter, please give us a thumbs up, a like, and subscribe. Hit the little bell and get a notification when I go live. On Facebook, give us a like and a share. I really appreciate everybody. And we'll talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.